Hi friends, Joe Edelmann here. I first wanted to thank all of you who have provided such lovely words of support in remembrance of my late grandmother. Making I Promise last week was an especially emotional and somewhat cathartic experience, but I'm so grateful to you all, and I'm sure she would be too. It really feels to me like we're a lot closer than the distances and the oceans that separate many of us, and to me that's really awesome. My grandmother was always a big supporter of my musical endeavors, and I was lucky to be able to share some of my videos with her before she passed. Still, I never did let her in on the secret of how I was able to move from instrument to instrument so quickly. This is a video I've been planning to make for some time. A lot of you have requested something like this, and with my recent influx of new subscribers, I figured it was a perfect time to take a stab at it. I'm going to try to deconstruct my process for making these cover videos. I really do enjoy every step of the process, from learning the songs and tracking parts to later mixing and editing, so I want to share my excitement and knowledge in the hopes that it might inspire some of you or assist some of you as well. That being said, there are entire videos worth of stuff that I could say about each of the steps, and I may choose to do more in the future, so I'll try my best to be comprehensive without being exhaustive. One thing to note is that I do things a little differently each time I make a video, depending on the song, its complexity, the arrangement, or the instruments required, and so on. I also tend to blur a lot of these steps together, mixing my recordings as I go, for example. Still, my overall workflow can be broken into 5 main parts. I'll try to walk through each of them with you right now, using some of the work that I did on I Promise as an example. First, I import an audio reference point for the cover into Logic. This could be a live or a studio performance of the song, or sometimes both. I've been using Logic for several years now, and I really like its features and its user interface. I previously used Pro Tools, but I find that its UI and its workflow are kind of stale and unintuitive, and not as great for software instruments as they are for live tracks. Since the reference track is typically mastered to a final loudness level, I'll lower it by somewhere from 6 to 12 decibels to be able to monitor it alongside my unmastered instrument tracks as I record them. Using Logic's beat mapping feature, which I did in this case because of the very regular rhythm and tempo of the song, or by manually adjusting the tempo automation, I'll create a scaffold in my project that mirrors the reference track. This allows me to play along with both the reference track and a dynamically adjusting click track, and it gives me good bar references for editing. Also, many songs apart from the more electronic or loop-based ones tend to breathe better at a slightly varying and more human tempo. I say slightly varying because Radiohead are talented musicians and they can keep that variance musical and subtle within a couple of BPM at max as opposed to very wide and distracting. Sometimes, and especially for Radiohead, I will need to build in some time signature automation as well to account for compound bars or for shifts between sections and different time signatures. This step goes a bit differently every time, depending on how much experience I have with the song. For Radiohead, I've usually already heard the song many times, but I may or may not have fiddled with playing along to it yet. Simply put, I will just listen and play along on the various instruments until I'm comfortable performing them. For drums, which are typically the first thing that I track, I'll figure out the main figures as well as any notable fills and where they occur. Sometimes I'll even mark out the important fills with special click sounds to warn me in my headphones that they're coming. For bass and guitars, I'll try to find an existing tab as a starting point. I often use the Songster app on my phone or a simple web search, or I'll watch other instrumentalists' covers and see how they approach things. I'll combine this with what I'm hearing from listening or from watching some relevant live Radiohead videos and praying for the right camera angles at the right time. And of course, many times I will seek out my friend David's fabulous articles on thekingofgear.com. Sometimes I can rely on memorization for straightforward enough parts, but for the ones with more nuance, for example, the bass lines to Deck's Dark or Johnny's tremolo picking at the end of Separator, I will write out a tab or I'll jot down some notes on an index card, or I'll use MIDI regions to generate a score. For your reference, I've added a guitar tab that I spun up quickly in MuseScore for I Promise in the description. For keyboard orchestration like strings or horns, I'll listen and construct the parts using MIDI, and then I'll use Logic's score view to export the sheet music. And you can see me do this here for the synth strings in I Promise. I provided this sheet music in the description as well. This step is usually mixed in with step 2 since I tend to build the song up piece by piece, switching between learning the parts and performing and recording them. I start with the drum and bass by playing along to the reference track, but at a certain point I'll switch to just performing along to my rhythm tracks in an effort to kind of gel with those and their groove. and then, rhythm or lead guitars. And finally, the vocal along with any guitar or piano that goes along with it. The number of takes that I do varies depending on the complexity of the song and the part in question, but it ranges anywhere from 1 to 3 to upwards of 10, for really tricky parts. Because of the tempo structure that I've created, and because I'm recording each part separately, I know that I can comp, which is the recording slang for mixing and matching parts of separate takes, or punch in other words, re-record small snippets if I really need to. But for the most part, I like to keep recording until I have a solid take that I can use for the basis of about 95% of the track. Sometimes, and especially for the solo piano type covers that I do, I'll opt for a single unedited take to capture more of that live feel, warts and all. I also tend to do that comping and a little bit of preliminary mixing as I put each instrument down. Things start to take shape and I can have a good balanced basis for the vocals at the end. In terms of my gear and my signal chain, the central brain of my studio is a Mackie Onyx 1620i Firewire enabled live mixer, which has 8 mic preamps and 4 stereo line input channels. Because of the Firewire connection, it also does my analog to digital and digital to analog interfacing with the MacBook Pro and with Logic. I also use a pair of QSC PA speakers to monitor my guitar amps alongside playback when I'm recording those. I have the popular KRK Rocket 6 monitors for when I'm just behind the desk, and they're solid. They're maybe a little bit exaggerated in the low end frequency, so I'll typically finish the mix on Yamaha HS7s. I've also got a Universal Audio 4710D preamp, which is a set of 4 preamps that can blend between tube and transistor sounds, and they have some built-in classic compression sounds in them. These I will use for the drums and for the vocals. Otherwise, everything's pretty much going through the preamps of the Mackie. In my opinion, and probably others will agree, drums are the hardest thing to get sounding good in a recording because it depends so much on the room that you're playing in and how that interacts with your mic placement and your playing dynamics. Guitars, on the other hand, you can pretty much slap a mic in front of the amp and get 90% of the sound just from that or from the effects pedals that you're using. My basement has a lowish ceiling and my drums are kind of in the corner of the room, both of which are sort of no-nos from a traditional recording perspective. As such, I don't typically use a room microphone, but I have gotten some pretty cool sounds by sticking one in the nearby amplifier room or in the tiled bathroom at the end of this room. In terms of microphone choices, on the drums I use a pretty basic setup. I have a Sennheiser E602 on the kick, a very common yet mighty SM57 on the top of the snare, and 2 Shure PG81s in a quasi-XY position as overheads. On songs with a lot of toms, I'll use these Shure clip-on mics from their drum kit. I think they're PG56s. The kick, the snare, and the 2 overheads will run through the 4 channels of the Universal Audio preamp with their compressors turned on. For the bass, I run an XLR cable direct out from my Gens-Benz shuttle amp head, and then I'll typically use Logic's bass amp simulators to spin up an Ampeg style, kind of big stack sound for more body. For guitars, I have my amplifiers set up in a side room, and this is for sound isolation purposes when I'm playing and recording with my Burn Holiday bandmates, for example on our In Rainbows and our OK Computer cover sessions. I'll use either a Shure SM57 or a Sennheiser E906 on the guitar amps, mic'd maybe a ½ inch from the grill and in the middle of the speaker cone. I'm mostly using my lovely sounding Vox AC30 these days, and especially for the Radiohead stuff, but sometimes I also use a Fender Deluxe Reverb or a Hot Rod Deluxe. The Marshall is strictly for emergency Jimmy shred scenarios, Page or Hendrix. For guitar effects, I will usually mix and match and pull in and out certain pedals as needed for certain sounds. You can check my Radiohead Pedal Boards Explored video for more information, but here's my basic setup these days with heavy hitters like the King of Gears Oxford Drive, the Small Stone Phaser, the Deluxe Memory Man, and the Space Echo. For keyboards, I use my Nord Piano 2 and my Dave Smith Prophet Rev 2 most of the time, and I will run them into a stereo DI box that goes to 2 channels of the Mackie. For stuff involving software instruments and MIDI, I often use a Bluetooth MIDI transmitter out of the back of this old M-Audio Keystation 49E. Finally, for vocals, my main squeeze is the Electro Voice RE20, which of course I stole from Tom, as seen in Radiohead's own basement performances. It's a great mic, and it's really great for high or falsetto singing because it has a nice smooth low end that rounds out your sound, versus some traditional condenser microphones that are very bright or sibilant. This is also sort of blended with steps 2 and 3 because, as I mentioned, I do a lot of mixing as I go, especially on parts like the drums where I want to add some plugins to get the vibe I'm going for right off the bat. But once I have everything together, it's usually just minor tweaks or adding additional EQ or compression to taste. A lot of times it comes down to simple volume automation to make sure that all the different elements shine when they need to and hide when they don't. Automation is really powerful stuff, and it's definitely a lesson I learned as I studied mixing. Lately I've been using Logic's stock channel EQ and compressor plugins a lot, but I do have a small collection of third-party audio plugins that I turn to in specific cases. Some of my favorite of these plugins to use are the Sound Toys collection. I use their little plate reverb on pretty much every mix I do, especially vocals, and their Echo Boy delay whenever I need a tape or analog echo for vocals or additional ambience on the guitars.
I say my prayers every night. Say my prayers every night.
Another one of theirs is the Devil Lock Deluxe, which is an extreme compressor that I use to get more gain and fatness out of my Electro Voice mic, or for getting a bigger, noisier drum sound out of my overheads.
Say my prayers every night. I say my prayers every night.
In addition to the Sound Toys plugins, I also use the SSL channel strip and bus compression plugins from Waves a fair amount of the time on different things. Finally, I will do a pseudo master for my mixed track by adding a chain of plugins to the stereo output. Typically some brightening from Logic's Exciter plugin, a bit of SSL style compression from Waves, and Logic's Bit Crusher and Adaptive Limiter plugins to add clipping and bring the gain up to an acceptable level. Before I add these plugins, though, I try to aim for about 3 to 6 decibels of headroom, and sometimes more so that things don't get too squashy and lifeless once I add the compression. In this final step, I'll bring the video clips that I've recorded using my Sony a6300 camera together with the final audio. I tend to shoot at 30 frames per second in 4K resolution using Sony's S-Log3 color setting. I use Final Cut Pro, and I make heavy use of their multicam clip editing feature, which is great to just kind of direct on the fly and cut between my different instrument performances after synchronizing them to the audio track. When I have a basic edit made that way, I'll use the MLUT plugin to add a preset lookup table, which automatically converts the S-Log format into a standard color spectrum. Hopefully this has been helpful to you all, and I'd be happy to make some more videos in the future like this, dissecting some of the subcomponents of the process that I mentioned. For now, be well, be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys again soon.